Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview, where we take a look at the stories being followed in the upcoming edition of the North Coast Journal. I'm your host, Dave Frank, and I'm joined today by Thad Greenson, news editor, and Jennifer Famiko Cahill, arts and features editor of the North Coast Journal. Hey, guys.
How you doing, David?
Pretty well. I unfortunately wasn't around last week, but I heard you guys did fantastic, so that's really good. It's good to be back.
Nice to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. Let's just dive right in and talk about what's on the cover this week, Thad.
Yeah, we have a cover story this week that is in kind of sticking with the Labor Day theme, and it is looking back at the Great Timber Strike of 1935, which I'll admit, before this story kind of came on my radar, I knew very little about, but was a pretty pivotal moment in Humboldt County history that has tons of reverberations in our current environment. It's kind of that was something that really struck me in the reporting of it, is just how many of these issues we're still talking about as a community and a society.
It's pretty incredible. I got the chance to check it out before we are recording, which it's really informative. I definitely recommend people go check it out. Why don't you frame it for us a little bit and tell us about, the background? What it was, the strike, like how did it come to be?
Yeah, so I think as everybody knows, or most of our viewers know, timber was long kind of the backbone of the Humboldt County economy. And so when the Great Recession hit, the Great Depression hit, there was just tremendous reverberations in home building, and all kinds of construction. And the timber market really tanked. And so it was just kind of decimating for the local economy here in Humboldt County. And tons of people were laid off. That, of course, the Great Depression led to this labor movement and the New Deal and a bunch of kind of progressive policies, including a national law signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that kind of gave people the right to organize, the right to unionize, the right to collective bargaining. And so kind of with that as a backdrop, in the early 1930s in Humboldt County, kind of as the economy was clawing its way back, timber started to come back, and timber markets started to thrive again, and more Humboldt County laid off mill workers were being brought back into the mills. But when the market tanked, wages tanked horribly too. And so there came this point in kind of the 1933 or so, 1934, when more and more people were working. Timber barons were making a lot of money again, but wages had stagnated, and they were still kind of in the pre-depression rate, which was mill workers getting paid 35 cents an hour and working 60-hour work weeks. And so kind of with that as a backdrop, not just in Humboldt County, but over the entire Pacific Northwest, timber workers or mill workers specifically, started to move to unionize and to collective bargain. And so the Humboldt County's mill workers were in this kind of unique position where they were honestly seemingly kind of being taken advantage of by the mills, by the timber barons here, but then also kind of fell into this place where they were used as leverage to join a larger labor movement that really may not have had their best interests at heart.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part, that they were asking for marginal amounts of increase in wage and like slightly less hours, but this became part of that national and regional movement where the Northwest Council of Lumber and Sawmill Workers had much, more demands. Can you tell us a little bit about how that played out and then led to the ultimate resistance from the timber barons?
Yeah, so there was talk of local organizing. They formed a union, and their demands, as you said, were more modest. So they requested a raise to 50 cents an hour and a reduction in their work week to 48 hours. And then their third ask, which was one of the biggest, was to have the mills actually recognize the labor unions themselves. And there were some indications that this might be feasible, that this was a reasonable ask. And then the national union, based in Washington State, where mill workers had better rates and better wages and better conditions, made a pretty humongous ask at that time, especially compared to what Humboldt County mill workers were making. And so they asked for a raise to 75 cents an hour, a reduction in the work week to 30 hours a week, paid holidays and other benefits, and the recognition of their union. And they had a rep come down to the Eureka to talk to the Eureka Union, and gave a really impassioned speech about how everybody was going to band together, and no carpenter was going to build with redwood, no electrician was going to do anything with redwood, was going to put wires into redwood built houses, and everybody was going to stand in solidarity together and bring the timber barons to their knees. And during kind of this contentious meeting, where anybody who kind of questioned that and wanted to go with the more reasonable previous ask was kind of labeled a company stooge or whatever, and they ultimately voted to cast their lot in with the National Union and match their asks, which led to the Great Strike that started in May of 1935.
So the title of your article is A Brutal End. But before we get to that brutality, there's a little bit that you spell out about how there was some stage set. So in other words, like one example is that the timber barons hired some defense and employed some munitions. You want to tell us a little bit about how they prepared for that confrontation?
Yeah, so they kind of prepared on two fronts. One was just kind of this PR blitz. And so, I think it's reasonable to say that the Humboldt Standard and the Humboldt Times, the two newspapers that were the dailies that were in play at the time and then ultimately merged to form the Times Standard sometime later, that their coverage of this was not exactly neutral. And they very much kind of took the Mills side and kind of echoed their talking points. And so the Mills did a lot of things about kind of offering loyalty pledges to employees that weren't picketing, and those were reportedly offered under some duress, some threat of firing and stuff like that. And the Times Standard the Humboldt Times and the Humboldt Standard would echo those and really cast this labor effort as the work of outside agitators and people who aren't even from here, and who really wanted to kind of tear down the mills and tear down the local economy. So they had that front that was really effective. And then the mills also both brought in outside workers to keep mill production up. But then they really were preparing, especially as the strike, kind of went on week after week, and some of the picket lines got a little bit more contentious. They really were preparing for violent confrontation, it seems. So they hired, a group of security guards who the union deemed, armed thugs. But there's kind of a bunch of stories of alleged allegations, anyway, of intimidation on their part. And then they also outfitted them with some pretty high-powered weapons. And so there's first, let me just detour here real quick and say that I pulled really heavily from this book, Organized the Great Lumber Strike of Humboldt County, 1935. It's by Frank Owenstein and Rachel Harris, and it is fantastic. I urge everybody to pick it up. It has just not just a great retelling of the strikes and what happened, but also a lot of primary documents. And so one of them that they have is they unearthed this letter from a munitions salesman, a tear gas salesman, back to his company, where he's just basically I just had the best sales day of my life. I went and I sold $12,000 worth of tear gas to the lumber companies. I sold gas to the highway patrol. I sold gas to the sheriff's office and the Eureka Police Department. And if things really pop off here, I'm sure I'm going to sell 5 times more. So life is good. And
it was the tear gas that actually ends up being kind of critical,
which really kind of pops off this really violent confrontation, which ultimately ends the strike. Absolutely.
Which is a great segue. Let's talk about what and where when the incident, the main violent end that you referenced takes place.
Yeah, so the strike was really kind of entering its last days in mid-June of 1935, and it became apparent to a lot of the mill workers that it was just a hopeless cause. That they were asking for too much. That the timing was bad. That they were negotiating with unions that really didn't understand kind of the local particulars of Humboldt County and its economy. And so the strike was kind of waning. And the Longshoremen's Union, which had stood in solidarity with local Humboldt County mill workers by saying, we're not going to ship any timber out of Humboldt County from these mills, started to waver also. And so there's kind of this pivotal moment where on June 21st, two higher-ups in the Longshoremen's Union and the Craftsmen's Union were going to come visit Humboldt County to kind of gauge support for the strike on the ground. And so the union workers were like, this is our chance to really show them that we're still invested, we're still fighting, we're still standing strong. And so they tried to organize kind of a big show of force with a massive picket. And they wanted to kind of consolidate all efforts and do it at a singular mill. And so they chose the Holmes Eureka Mill, which is at the current site of the Bayshore Mall. And that morning, as you know, picketers started to arrive at I think about 6:30 a.m. And then some of them started kind of barricading the entrance to the mill, and there was definitely some very contentious interactions between workers coming to the mill and the picketers. There was some rocks thrown, there was cars blocked. Things were definitely kind of escalating, and it kind of came to a head when a local security guard was trying to report to work, and his car got kind of pushed back out of the mill entrance, back into the street, and a woman held up a big rock and kind of said, you don't want a piece of this. And he sped off to the police station to get reinforcements, basically. And when the police returned, they returned in force, and like everything we talk about as far as de-escalation training and all those things that we want to see in our police officers nowadays, especially when dealing with kind of protesters and stuff like that, not apparent here in 1935. And so there's this kind of crazy anecdote about the police chief kind of like standing out on the running board of a car, driving into where the picketers are, shooting his pistol into the ground, saying like, anybody want a piece of this? You're going to let me through, just kind of screaming at people. And from the accounts that we found, the picketers at this point were really like, whoa, this is getting way out of hand, and like it's probably time for us to just go. This isn't going to end well for us, standing here with rocks. And so they started to leave, and another car with officers took a shotgun loaded with one of those canisters of tear gas and shot it into the crowd, and it hit a woman in the back, and she just fell like a ton of bricks. And the picketers around her thought that she'd actually been shot with a shotgun. They didn't realize that it was tear gas and that the canister had just hit her. And so after kind of immediately coming to her aid and finding her bleeding, they got really angry and rushed the police. And really violent confrontations ensued. Somebody took the police chief's gun from him and was beating him senseless with it. There's other anecdotes about officers, again, having their weapons taken from them, being beaten. And during this, one of the security guards, the private security guards for the mill, starts shooting into the crowd, and the police chief starts shooting into the crowd, and another officer starts shooting into the crowd. There's an anecdote about an officer emptying his revolver into the crowd and then kind of in a panic driving around to try to find somebody who knows how to fire the submachine gun that's in the back of his car, which raises a whole bunch of questions. But anyway, he finally finds a mill worker who's like, yeah, I can fire, a working mill worker, not one of the picketers, who's like, I can fire that gun. And they bring him back, and it jams after a couple of rounds. But anyway, there's this massive melee, and it ultimately leaves two of the picketers and a bystander dead. William Carl, was a 62-year-old woodcutter, was shot and died instantly at the scene. And then Harold Edlund, who's a 35-year-old chopper who came to Mr. Carl's aid and was shot, died some days later. And then Paul Lempella, who is just a 19-year-old who reportedly just went to kind of see this all unfold and was some like 400 yards away, just sitting on the ground, was shot in the neck and later died. And scores of picketers were injured. 5 officers were taken to the hospital to be treated. All of them, the newspapers note, returned to work later that day, so they weren't too badly hurt. But it was a pretty gruesome scene.
The lack of investigation about those deaths, and the lack of any kind of discipline over that, or repercussions for those who fired those shots, is astounding to me, looking back at it.
Yeah, I think the aftermath of the shooting tells you kind of everything you need to know about the power structures that were in play at the time. And as Jen said, there was no investigation that we could find into like who actually shot these picketers, like who fired the rounds that downed these picketers or killed these picketers, much less any talk of kind of prosecution or holding anybody accountable. They just weren't even interested in kind of learning that information. Meanwhile, I think 140 people were rounded up and arrested in the ensuing day and a half and accused of rioting or conspiring against the even like kind of treasonous charges. It was wild. None of them were convicted, I should quickly add.
Yeah, I know we're going way into the story, but just to kind of wrap up, so there's 2 last things I hope you can comment on. One is the fact that the charges, the prosecutors stopped charging them because of I'll let you tell why, and then also how this weapon, this Thompson machine gun, became an infamous part of our law enforcement collection.
Yeah, so the first is to the trials. The trials were very contentious, and they were very very public, very high profile cases, and just to make it short, the prosecutor lost the first couple, had one person acquitted, and then a number of hung juries. And in these initial trials, it became obvious that some of the officers involved perjured themselves and just kind of lied about how the events that transpired, kind of claimed that they had been attacked before firing tear gas into the crowd and things like that. And so after a few of these, just a few weeks into the prosecutions, the district attorney kind of announced that he wasn't going to be following through with any of these other cases. And so ultimately all 140 of these people who had been jailed were released. The Tommy gun's interesting. It's kind of the kind of what got me reporting on the story, honestly. But there's a Thompson submachine gun that's been on display in the Eureka Police Department briefing room for apparently 20 years or something, and nobody quite knew its story. We're still not entirely sure, although I feel pretty sure that this is the same gun that the Eureka Police Department had back then. It's kind of one of those things of just kind of historical relics that lose their significance after time when there's just an institutional memory drain and things kind of fall out of view. And so right now, the Eureka Police Department has tasked one of its detectives with kind of trying to track down the history of this gun and confirm if it was the gun used in this incident, and if so, then what they should do with it. And there's talk of possibly donating it to a local museum or something like that.
Fascinating story, Thad. Thank you for giving us the quickest version you could do. Definitely, if you're remotely interested at all, check it out. It's really cool and worth reading and exploring more.
And if you find it interesting, pick up this book because it's good stuff.
Right on. Jennifer, how about you? What's going on the arts and features beat this week?
Well, I have a really great recipe for you from Simona Carini. She, Queen of Vegetables, is here to save your summer. Because you know what? I get it. We're in September. Everybody wants to pull out their sweaters, but none of us had the hot back summer we were promised. And also, slow your roll, pumpkin spice gang. We are not done with summer. While the tomatoes are still out there, we're not going to do it yet. Put away your apple pies, all of that. Just give me a minute. Let me live. So Simona has this great recipe for tomatoes, which she encourages you to explore all the different kinds of tomatoes. It's just a really, really simple: cut some vegetables, toss them together with dressing, tomatoes and cucumbers. And as she puts it, the constant companion of the tomato, basil. She mentions these different kind of varieties of tomatoes and cucumbers that have fantastic names, which maybe I would have gotten into gardening if I'd known you could name your own vegetable. Among the tomatoes, cherry bomb, purple sunrise, Berkeley pink tie-dye. It's lovely. And then the cucumbers are what are they? Painted serpent.
Weed strains.
Yeah, before I know, right? I was Girl Scout cookie, what are we doing? Thad mentioned that he is all about lemon cucumbers.
I'll eat them like an apple. They're delicious.
It's fantastic. It's why, all of a sudden in the summer, we get so excited about vegetables and the awesomeness of a tomato on white bread sandwich with mayo. I'm sorry, Thad, that you need the mayo and just salt and pepper. It's bliss. It's bliss. Mere mention in this story of a Panzanella salad set me off on the path of Panzanella, that torn, staled Italian bread with tomatoes and basil and balsamic, and you're just so happy. So absolutely, take this opportunity, make this salad, go to the farmer's market this week, and just revel in the tomatoes while we have them, and and also help a farmer out. It is smoky out there. It is a tough time to be working on a farm. So splurge on yourself, send some money to our local farmers, and just revel in the last little bites of summer that we have left before all these fall loving cable knit sweater army just overtakes us.
Sounds pretty wonderful. I have to admit, I went to the farmer's market on Saturday and had this very same salad, and it was amazing.
So good.
Mm-hmm. And melons. Got to do a pitch of melons.
Absolutely. Get the melons, let them make a fragrance in your car, drive around in your melon mobile. Also, just for those of you who like masochists, there's a great story. One of the Sea to Summit stories that Holly Ernest is writing for us in her series of like 10 different bike, hike, sometimes a little swimming adventures where you start by putting your toes in the ocean and then head up to some sort of a peak. And this week it is the peak of Salmon Mountain, which is Humboldt County's highest point. It's, 1 million miles up? I can't remember. But it's insane. And it's like Bald Hills Road, and like just going up is crazy. But then as Holly learned, there's an old Japanese expression that coming down Mount Fuji is harder than going up. And it's true of Salmon Mountain also, because she was deep in the pain. She also shared with me a great photograph of her toward the end of the trip, flipping off the camera with both hands because she was just, somebody asked her, how you feeling? And she was just like, but it's a great adventure story. And she goes with a local father and daughter, the Odell family, and they are just full of energy, and they make it possible for her to muscle through on this really rough trip that was evidently worth it.
Well, I looked it up when you told me about it. It's 7,000, almost 7,000 feet up. So it's pretty serious climb.
That's what I said. 1 million miles.
It seems totally worth it unless that's just way too much for your brain to process.
I'm really going to enjoy seeing that view from like a helicopter.
I'll share photos with you when I go. I think that's just about going to do it for us this week. Thank you both. Jennifer, that was awesome. Between the food and the adventure, and Thad, the history, this was a really great week, so I appreciate you guys.
Thanks, David. Good to have you back.
Thanks. North Coast Journal on newsstands now. Pick one up. Stay informed. They're also available online anytime. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay informed, and stay entertained. Till next time. Bye, guys.
Bye.